Yeah, thanks for having me on today. Like you said, my name's Alyssa Essman. I actually did my grad programs here at Ohio State with Dr. Mark Laux, serving in this visiting role, covering some teaching and extension kind of duties as we look to onboard some new weed science faculty. And so as we look to this year and kind of the future of weed management in Ohio over the next couple of years, something that's become apparent is that water hemp is going to be a bigger player. And so today I'll be talking about water hemp management and some of the things that we can do to kind of prepare for this weed. So for many years, the OSU Weed Science program here at Ohio State has conducted a pre-harvest survey in soybean. And so this is a complement to the pre-harvest survey conducted by county educators in the state. And the goal here is for us to kind of get a big picture snapshot of a lot of the weeds that we're dealing with and to kind of predict what we're going to be facing in the next year. So this past year, what we saw was that the number one weed and the greatest percentage of fields was giant ragweed. The second weed, and what kind of caught our attention in this year, was actually water hemp. And so water hemp was present in 11% of the fields that we encountered. Mare's tail was at 10%, which was kind of a surprise to me. And then the grass and foxtail species, so things like Johnson grass and also our foxtails, were at 9%, and volunteer corn at 8%. So this work is funded by the Soybean Council, and it gives us an idea again of kind of the weeds that were maybe a problem in 2022 and to kind of help us predict what we'll be seeing in the next year. So what caught our attention was this water hemp number. So previously, from 2020 and prior to that, we had rated the pigweeds as one species essentially. So we looked at water hemp, redroot, and palmer kind of together. In 2021, we broke that out into these three different species. So water hemp, palmer, and redroot. In 2020, all three of those pigweed species were found in 8% of fields. 2021, water hemp alone was found in 7% of fields. And then this past year, 2022, we saw water hemp in 11% of fields. So we have kind of a map of what this looked like this past year. The counties in white had 0% of fields with water hemp. That doesn't necessarily mean there wasn't any water hemp in the county. We just didn't encounter it randomly on our survey. The counties in kind of this very light pink shade were in 1 to 10% of fields. This next darker shade, water hemp was found in 11 to 20% of fields. Kind of the darker coral color, water hemp was in 21 to 30% of fields. And then this very dark red, water hemp was found in 31 to 40% of fields. And so this is kind of a relatively high increase over just the past couple of years in water hemp. Not a big surprise based on trends in the Midwest, but definitely something we want to be looking out for. And so this was part of my grad program, was helping out, manage the survey and also conduct the herbicide screen of the pigweed seed we sampled at that time. So for all these different pigweed species, they can be kind of hard to identify, especially at that small stage where we need to be applying our products. And so we can go through kind of some of the key identifying characteristics that can be helpful to look at for these pigweed species at that time. So redroot and smooth pigweed, these ones are the hairy species, right? So they have a very hairy stem and leaves. They have very rough egg-shaped leaves. One key identifier are these petioles. And so the petioles are often shorter than the leaf, and the smooth pigweed is suggested to have a little bit less hair than the redroot pigweed, right? And so another identifier for these two is the inflorescence. And so the flower of the redroot pigweed will be much more stacked than the smooth pigweed. Powell amaranth, we don't see too much in the state. Have heard a little bit about it up in the Northeast region, maybe near some vegetable production or non-row crops, but we do see it. It has a sparsely hairy stem, so it is also hairy, but it has very diamond-shaped leaves that can sometimes be a darker green than some of the other species. Kind of like Palmer, the petiole can be longer than the leaf, but unlike Palmer, Powell is hairy. Spiny amaranth is hairless along its stem and leaves. It has very long ovate leaves, and it can sometimes have this kind of white thumbprint watermark on the leaf surface. We see spiny less in row crop production, but do get a lot of questions about it in pasture, sometimes in hay. So it has spines at the leaf nodes, so kind of these long spines at the base of each leaf. And then our last two species are kind of those ones that are a bit of a greater threat. And so part of the importance of identifying these is the fact that they pose, a greater economic concern than maybe some of the other species based on how aggressive they are and the different resistance traits they possess. And so Palmer amaranth is hairless along its stem and leaves. It has very egg-shaped leaves. And one of the key identifiers here is these petioles. And so these petioles are often as long or longer than the leaf itself. Something interesting about Palmer is that it's actually native to the Southwest US and northern Mexico. For many years, there was kind of this high alert about Palmer for good reason, right? It's very competitive, can take over very quickly. It's an aggressive weed species. But last fall at kind of our regional weed science extension meeting, there was some conversation about, some of the possible reasons why we've seen Waterhemp take over in recent years, maybe more than Palmer. And one of the suggestions there that came out from that meeting was that, where it's native, Palmer is native to kind of drier, more droughty regions. And it was noted that some weed scientists had observed it more in dry years than in years with adequate or excessive rain. And so this, along with the fact that, we've had this very aggressive campaign against Palmer, growers have done a really great job of eradicating it where it's been. And on our survey over the past many years, we haven't really encountered it randomly more than twice, unlike Waterhemp, where we've seen this drastic increase over time. And so Waterhemp is hairless on the stem and leaves like Palmer, but instead of having egg-shaped leaves, it has these very long lanceolate leaves, and the petioles are shorter than the leaf, right? And it is native to the Midwest. So like the name suggests, Waterhemp is water-loving. It does really well in regions with a lot of rainfall. So before we even get into some of the herbicide resistance issues that make Waterhemp really problematic, we can talk about some of these biological characteristics that give it an advantage over some of our other weed species that we face. And the first of these is this immense seed production. Waterhemp can produce anywhere from 100,000 to upwards of 1 million seeds per plant. And this can be kind of dependent on a couple of things. One is environmental conditions. So in subpar environmental conditions, maybe that plant produces closer to 100,000 seeds per plant. In ideal conditions, maybe upwards of 1 million. But the other and maybe bigger factor there is competition. So in really high competitive situations, maybe we have a large dense patch of Waterhemp. Maybe we're closer to that 100,000 seeds per plant, or and the non-competitive situations and ideal environmental conditions, upwards of 1 million seeds for a single plant. On a plant for plant basis, compared to some of the other summer annual species we see in our cropping systems, something like cocklebur, Waterhemp actually isn't that competitive as a plant. But part of what gives it this edge is its ability to just take over through this immense seed production. And it's part of the reason why, I know Dr. Laux has shown a couple great slides of just a couple of years following the introduction, Waterhemp can take over an entire area, and that's due in part to this immense seed production. And not only does it produce a lot of seed, it can grow extremely fast, upwards to 1.5 inches or sometimes greater in a single day. Some of our other speakers this morning have talked about the unpredictability in weather patterns, how we're seeing more rain in the spring, just a couple of days not being able to get into the field. Maybe we can miss water hemp when we think about the fact that we have to control it by the time it's about 4 inches tall, right? And so this extremely fast growth rate is part of what makes water hemp very difficult to get controlled. Another really important factor here to consider, and kind of changes how we think about how we manage with our herbicide programs, is this prolonged emergence window. And so a lot of our weed species kind of have a time frame in which they generally emerge, and then it kind of drops off at a different point in the season. And so here we have a graphic with some data out of Iowa looking at the cumulative emergence of the weed species across various states from about early to mid-May through late July. So this green line here is woolly cupgrass. We can see woolly cupgrass starts to germinate in May and drops off kind of towards the end of May and then finishes for the season. Velvet leaf will germinate in this area up through about mid-June, and then it kind of drops off. Giant foxtail is a little more stretched out, but when we look at this red line here, the water hemp, we can see it actually starts to emerge a bit later than some of these species, but can essentially emerge all season long, right? So it's not just this initial flush of water hemp that we have to deal with at the beginning of the season, and it can actually germinate and grow season long. And weather factors can complicate this. Last year we kind of had a more dry June. A lot of areas of the state kind of picked up in precipitation, kind of July and August, and we had kind of this ideal conditions for maybe this late flush of water hemp. So if those factors weren't enough, water hemp also has a very high genetic diversity compared to some of our other plants. And so water hemp is dioecious, just meaning it has separate male and female plants, and when those cross, that increases our genetic diversity and then the likelihood for resistance in the offspring population. And so this picture came from our survey, and I kind of like it because it's pretty, but it also shows kind of the difference in the female and the male plants, right? And so our female plants have a flower that's a little more stretched out, and the male plants are a little more stacked, and we call them fluffy. Right. And the other thing we can do to identify late season, because they can look really similar, is to just kind of take that seed head and flush some of that seed out, and that small black seed will only be on those female plants. We can also see this when we're just looking at our field. So something like mare's tail, if we look out and we see some mare's tail in our field, right, we know that's mare's tail. They look pretty uniform, the nice grain plants, either in a rosette or bolted. Water hemp, we can look out and see kind of this range of different appearance, right? We can have really dark green plants that are short. We can have really tall plants that are pink or red, and that's due in part to this high genetic diversity. But for our purposes in trying to control these weeds, it's that high genetic diversity that gives them this characteristic to be able to really rapidly adapt to our herbicide programs. And so the two confirmed sites of action to herbicides that have been confirmed in Ohio are the group 2 herbicides, so our ALS inhibitors, and then the group 9 herbicides or glyphosate. As I mentioned, we do this pre-harvest survey, and at that time, we actually do collect pigweed seed, and we bring it back to the greenhouse to kind of conduct these preliminary screenings to give us a snapshot of what we might be experiencing in Ohio in terms of resistance development. And so this is something I've been able to work on over the past several years here And initially, when we were doing these screens, we were looking at our group 2 herbicides. So imazethapyr, we looked at group 9, our glyphosate, and then we looked at 14, our PPO inhibitor, which we used amesiphen. We generally saw a decrease in the effectiveness of those products over time, and based on some of the trends in the region, we have recently switched to looking at group 4, group 5, 15, and 27, based on the fact that we kind of can assume resistance to our group 2 and 9 herbicides, and potentially there's group 14 in our Waterhemp populations. And so based on the results of kind of the switch and the chemistries we're evaluating over the last couple of years, there might be some resistance to our 2,4-D products, or to our group 4 products, which we use 2,4-D in the greenhouse. And there probably is resistance to our group 15 and group 27, right? And so when we think about the effective herbicide options that we have for the control of water hemp, this is essentially the lot of them, right? And so it's these group 15s and also the group 4 that are extremely concerning when we think about the development of resistance in water hemp. So in starting to think about the control of water hemp, kind of that first step is generally just trying to prevent it to get into our operation, right? That's kind of the first step, the easiest path to not having to deal with this weed. And we can do that in a number of ways. And of course, you know, it can be difficult when we think about how small these seeds are and how many of them there are. But kind of that first step is thinking about equipment, where we've purchased our equipment, is there water hemp in that area, and then trying to be kind of meticulous about cleaning it up before we use it on our fields. Other potential sources are livestock feed and manure, maybe from somewhere that, you know, had water hemp, or it's in the feed, or in crepe seed or cover crop seed. Starting to think about our herbicide programs, this is a chart Mark put together that I really like because it shows kind of all of the target applications we have throughout the season, and then the ones that can be most helpful we kind of want to think of when we think of water hemp control. In terms of fall applications, those aren't necessarily super helpful for water hemp. Sometimes we get this question if a residual in the fall would be helpful for water hemp in the spring. And, you know, a lot of our products that could be applied in the fall don't generally persist long enough to be effective in the spring. There's a very limited selection, and we looked at water hemp emergence, and, you know, that tends to emerge a little later. And so fall applications aren't really an option. Because of this late emergence, even the spring burn down doesn't always, you know, get our water hemp, but what we can do at that time is include a residual product to kind of extend the length of control and get those first emerging water hemp plants. Like we've talked about, you know, the springs are getting more unpredictable in terms of weather, and, you know, weed management is just one factor that we have to consider in our crop production. But, you know, to the best of our abilities, a timely post application before these weeds reach about that 4-inch size can be really beneficial for getting these controlled. One introduction into our system that can be really beneficial for the control of water hemp is this overlapping residual. So including a residual product in our post application, kind of extend that period of control, bridge the gap from our first application of a residual product, and get us later into the season once we have canopy closure and our small seeded species like pigweed, you know, are really affected by light. So once we kind of shade them out, that's going to go a long way into reducing that season-long emergence. But based on these biological characteristics, you know, a second post application might be necessary for control. There's a number of products that are generally effective on water hemp, and we can kind of think about them based on the potential resistance we have in our water hemp population. So if we're not dealing with any sort of resistance, kind of that top tier or the most effective products that we can use would be flumioxazin, metribuzin, sulfentrazone, pyroxasulfone, and isoxaflutol. And then kind of that next set of herbicides that will, provide control, but maybe aren't quite as good are metolachlor and esmetolachlor, dimethanamide, pendimethalin, acetochlor, and linuron. Once we start to develop some of this resistance in our populations, we start to lose some options. And so once we've developed PPO resistance to our group 14 herbicides, metribuzin, pyroxasulfone, and isoxaflutol are the options. And the flumioxazin and sulfentrazone get moved in kind of that second tier of products. Where there's resistance to our PPO inhibitors and our group 15 herbicides, the effective remaining options then are metribuzin and isoxaflutol. Thinking about the residual herbicides that we can add to the post for extended control of water hemp, again, we have kind of this ranking of the products that are most effective, those that will work, and then the ones that are generally not recommended. And so our most effective options tend to be, are these group 15 herbicides. And so kind of that top recommendation then is pyroxasulfone. So, the active Insidua, Anthemax, and Perpetuo. We can follow with metolachlor or esmetolachlor in our dual products, or an esmetolachlor or acetochlor with fameciphin, like in Warrant Ultra and Prefix. And then kind of lower down that list are our less effective options, acetochlor or Warrant, or dimethanamide and Outlook. These are some nice graphics out of the University of Minnesota. And so, they have a little bit different climate than us. And so the water hemp emergence might be a little different, but this can be kind of a nice visualization of this layered or overlapping residual concept. And so at the bottom here, we have, our growing season, May through August, and then kind of this elongated water hemp emergence throughout the season. This red bar here is the effective concentration for control, or the amount of product that we need in that top layer of soil to be able to, inhibit the germination of these weeds. And so if we include our pre-product in our residual in our pre-product at the time of plant, we can see that our yellow bar of effectiveness goes down throughout the season until we reach that threshold of the effective concentration for control. And this idea of the layered residual, and the benefit here is that if we include a residual product in our post-application about 30 days after planting, we're kind of bridging that gap, right? And so our effective concentration for control is again at an appropriate level, and will carry us through the season throughout that kind of large late flush of water hemp emergence later into the season. And so this is an illustration, again, looking at this layered residual concept. So we have our water hemp control on the left here, and these are days after planting. And so we can see that if this layered application is made about 30 days after planting, and the treatments where we have this layered residual, about 70 days later, we're going to have around 90% control of the water hemp. Whereas if we include our residual in that pre-only, it'd be about 76% of water hemp control. And so here's a chart looking at kind of the general effectiveness of our soybean trait systems. And this is kind of, assuming a comprehensive herbicide program and not just relying on these traits for total control. So for water hemp and non-GMO and Roundup Ready soybeans, it's just going to be generally very difficult to get this controlled based on the limited options, especially in this post applications. These increased options in our LibertyLink GT27 and the Extend systems provide increased control, but the most excellent control will come from the Extend and Enlist, where we have the most options for control of water hemp late in the season. And that's generally how we've addressed weeds in soybean production for some time now, right? And so compared to corn, where there were some more herbicide options, once these Roundup Ready beans were introduced in 1996, they became very popular because then we had, a really effective option for weed control in our soybean production. We had Liberty Link in 2009, Roundup Ready to Extend in 2017, and Enlist. And this is kind of the path forward for weed management in soybean production, right? Are these stacked trait systems? But what's important to remember here is that a lot of these rely on the same chemistries that we've been using for a very long time, right? And so it's at this point, we kind of have to think about the stewardship of these products and how we're going to deal with the potential for herbicide resistance in these stacked trait systems, knowing, there's not really many new herbicide sites of action in the pipeline. So for a long time, we've been dealing with herbicide resistance kind of as it comes. And I think there's this movement now in weed science thinking about how can we be more proactive to kind of prevent herbicide resistance versus reactive to the best of our abilities, right? So how can we combat the current situation and also try to prevent future instances of resistance? And so this is kind of where this integrated pest management strategy comes in, right? And so this is the idea that we have many small hammers to kind of tackle this bigger issue. So, instead of just relying on our chemical control, also thinking about biological, cultural, and some mechanical options that we can use to hit it from every angle, right? And so cover crops are one of these many small hammers that we can use to fight herbicide-resistant weeds and potentially delay the development of herbicide resistance. And so cover crops have a number of benefits, right? They've been used for many years. There's kind of this renewed interest in cover cropping, and there's been a lot of surveys to kind of understand why. And a lot of these surveys, the first reason is generally soil health, right? That's no surprise. Cover crops are very beneficial to our soil systems. They reduce erosion, build organic matter, potentially decrease nutrient losses, capturing some of our nutrients from our system and contributing back into our cropping system. These dense roots can improve infiltration. We can increase our soil biodiversity and have a habitat for some beneficial insects and fungi. Oftentimes in these surveys, the very second reason for this increase in cover crop uses is actually the suppression of weeds. So there's various ways that cover crops suppress the weeds in our cropping systems. The first of which is this physical suppression. So this is the idea that, we have a lot of biomass, like Laura showed in a lot of her pictures. And this biomass kind of creates this mulch layer to physically inhibit the germination and growth of our weed species. Some of our cover crops can actually compete with our weeds for things like light nutrients and water at the times where they're growing together. A lot of cover crops are suggested to have this allelopathic effect. There's still a lot of ongoing research in this area to figure out, how much can we contribute to allelopathy versus some of these other factors. But it's this idea that, something like CRRI produces a compound that inhibits the germination and growth of our weeds. The termination that we do to kill the cover crop, things like spraying, mowing, and tilling, actually control weeds at that time. And cover crops also alter the seed environment, right? So they can change our soil moisture, our temperature, and our lights and pests present at the time of germination, right? Waterhemp is very small-seeded. Small-seeded weeds generally are very heavily influenced by light. So they typically need to be closer to that top layer of soil to be able to intercept light to germinate and grow. So just like canopy closure will kind of inhibit this growth or germination and growth of waterhemp, so will our cover crop species. And there's kind of two main drivers for this weed suppression by cover crops. One of these is no surprise. It's talked about a lot, and it is this biomass, or how much green matter and vegetation on a pounds per acre basis are we developing to physically suppress and shade out our weeds. So this is some data out of Purdue looking at early season weed biomass and cover crop biomass. And so what's clear in this study and a lot of studies in general is that the greater the biomass, the greater the weed suppression. Not only is it, a greater percent of weed control or suppression, but it's also less variable, right? So at lower levels of biomass, it's just a lot more variable in whether or not they will give us any benefit. And then the second driver, sometimes maybe a little more overlooked, is this ground cover, or how much area of the ground we're shading out with our cover crop. And so this is work out of Penn State, and this is the population decrease of horseweed at the time of the burn down, and the cover crop ground cover percent 10 weeks after planting. And so they saw, as there was a greater ground cover 10 weeks after planting, there was a greater reduction in the percent decrease in horseweed at the time of burn down. And this is kind of where that idea of herbicide resistance delay comes in from cover crops. It's this idea that we're reducing both the number and size of weeds present in our systems. And this can kind of do two things for us. When we think about how herbicide resistance develops, right, we're essentially selecting for those very few individuals within a population that randomly have developed resistance to our herbicides, right? Those reproduce, and over time, a greater percentage of our population possesses that resistance to our herbicide. If we're applying our products to a smaller number of weeds, potentially we're reducing the selection pressure on our remaining effective chemistries. The other thing it does is it reduces the size of weeds at the time of application. Like we talked about, most weeds like water hemp need to be controlled by the time they're about 4 inches tall. And that gives us some flexibility in our plant or in our post application, and also maybe improves effectiveness of the application. There's a number of environmental factors that can come into play into how much biomass and growth we have of our cover crops. These include things like the growing degree days, which influences both the cover crop growth and also the time of weed emergence, and kind of how those interact. Weather patterns really greatly influence cover crop growth, and I think we're going to see that this year, right? We had a really dry fall for a long period of time, so just like maybe the wheat had a hard time coming up, a lot of our seeded cover crops might have difficulty coming up this spring. And it also influences our field operations, how effectively or quickly we can get into the field and also terminate our cover crop. Soil fertility, there's been some work out of Penn State looking at soil fertility, and higher fertility in our fields increases the biomass of our cover crops, just like it increases our crop production. And then one of the big ones here is weed species. So depending on the life cycle, the seed characteristics and emergence patterns of our weed species, these interact differently and how well cover crops can suppress these weeds. So kind of going back to water hemp control, these fall seeded cover crops can be, one of these additional tools that we can use to reduce the size and number of these water hemp in our fields. And so this is a study out of Missouri looking at the effects of cereal rye and residual herbicide programs on early season water hemp emergence. And so we have early season water hemp emergence along the bottom here, and then on the left-hand side, we have a number of cover crop species and also herbicide programs. And so what this is showing is that, these spring applied residual herbicides can be effective at reducing our water hemp emergence, but so can cereal rye, right? A fall planted cover crop can reduce kind of that early season water hemp emergence. The idea with cover crops is that it can be one part of this comprehensive weed management strategies, integrated pest management, along with our comprehensive chemical programs, to kind of take this systems approach for controlling our weeds, but also managing for and thinking about herbicide resistance. So the effectiveness depends on, management and environmental factors, some of which are in our control and some of which are not, right? Weather is going to play a huge role in this. If we all had a crystal ball, and make it so much easier, but it can be really hard to know, when to manage our cover crop. They're generally most successful when implemented in kind of a tailored plan, year by year and field by field, making a difference based on weather from year to year, but also, the different weed populations in our different fields. And in general, the effects of cover cropping tend to compound over time and potentially reduce our weed populations with continued use. Thinking about other cultural controls, row spacing can make a difference. So this is work out of Missouri, looking at late season density of water hemp based on different row spacings. So essentially they found a greater late season density of water hemp in 30-inch rows compared to drilled or 15-inch. And again, this is going back to the idea that, water hemp is very small seeded. It needs that light to be able to germinate and grow. And so that canopy closure occurring earlier will be a great benefit for water hemp density reduction. And then in operations where mechanical control is an option, intense tillage can be one way to manage water hemp, especially thinking about those areas where we have a really high seed bank and a lot of water hemp pressure. So this work is looking at tillage treatments and looking at conventional and minimum tillage versus really deep tillage and the ability to bury amaranth seed. So essentially what they found was that, minimum and conventional till weren't really any different than no-till at effectively burying those seeds, but really deep tillage can get the seeds down to that level where they can no longer, push through that soil surface and germinate. To the best of our abilities, even if we do everything perfectly, for all the reasons we've talked about, the biological characteristics, the weather patterns, herbicide resistance, with water hemp escapes are just really likely. And so anytime we can scout, be able to identify this plant and then remove it from our fields late season before they set seed, that's going to have a great benefit down the road. And that's kind of this, what they've called this Achilles heel of water hemp, right? It has immense seed production. A lot of them are viable. We can greatly increase our pressure in just a couple of years, but those seeds are relatively short-lived. And so the majority of them will no longer be viable after about 3 to 5 years. For us, that means, really intense management over that time period means we can effectively eradicate water hemp, right? And so kind of the slogan over the past couple of years has been "Go Rogue, Stop the Seed." We had this bumper sticker campaign many years ago with that tagline. And the idea is, again, anytime we can reduce the contributions of water hemp seed into the seed bank, that's going to pay dividends down the road. If you're interested in the use of cover crops specifically for weed management, we do have a series of fact sheets covering some information on this, looking at species selection, establishment, different termination, timing, and methods. So thinking like planting green and herbicide resistance and carryover to cover crops. The best resource for weed control is the 2023 Weed Control Guide from Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. It now includes Missouri. This can be found either in a PDF or a hard copy, which comes with the PDF, and you can get this at your local extension store, e-store online, or at your local office. So just wanted to take a second to thank, all the great people I've gotten to work with over the years. Of course, Dr. Laux, who's, spearheaded this campaign and this program, Tony and Bruce, and then our amazing students, Betsy and Emily. And we have a number of weed management resources. If you're interested in this type of information or anything weed science, make sure to sign up for the core newsletter. These are all archived. So that means pretty much any weed control topic you can think of, Dr. Laux has probably written an article on it, and you can go find it somewhere on the internet. This QR code will take you to our website with all sorts of different resources and also a link to be able to purchase the Weed Control Guide. You can find us on Twitter at Ohio State Weed Sci. The Ag Crops team runs a Facebook page at Ohio State Agronomy. And then I did want to point out the OSU Weed Science YouTube. pretty much anything you can want to watch a video on, watching giant ragweed slowly die from paraquat, or watching Dr. Laux talk about fall applied herbicides, all of that and more can be found on the YouTube link.